Hello and welcome to the President's Podcast, right here on the record with the Ohio Senate. The views the news excludes. I'm your host, the Director of Communication for the Republican Caucus, the Majority Caucus, and the Ohio Senate. Always great to have back on the program the President of the Ohio Senate, Republican from Lima, Matt Huffman. How you been?
Good, John. How you doing?
I'm doing very well. Hey, a very interesting audit came out from Keith Faber's office, former Senate President when I started in the Senate. He was the Senate President during the 131st General Assembly. Now he is the state auditor. And he released a report last week that talked about how it's actually called the cost of concurrent enrollment, saying that over a 4-year period, 124,000 people were enrolled in Ohio Medicaid that were also concurrently enrolled in a Medicaid program from another state, costing Ohio $1 billion over 4 years. What's your thoughts on that?
Well, first of all, kudos to Auditor Faber and his team. One of the problems when you have an entity running a program that can't go out of business no matter how bad of a job they do is they don't follow the dollars like a private entity would. And unless you have a state auditor like Keith Faber who's aggressively looking into these things, it just happens. We know the disaster that happened when the Biden administration insisted on us not checking on unemployment compensation benefits, and the money came and it went out and there was hundreds of millions of dollars in fraud. But I should also say there are many other public programs that are subject to fraud, and it really depends, frankly, on the local follow-up. So in Allen County, we've got Joe Patton is a great local job and family services director. He goes out and does house visits to find out whether the person who's getting a check from time to time, if they live there. And he's told me many times they go, well, he hasn't lived here for 3 years. That guy lives in Michigan now. But he comes back, picks up his check, and goes back to Michigan. Unless you have both the state and local folks working to prevent this fraud, we're going to lose a lot of money. And it will never be as good as banks checking to make sure money's spent appropriately, or businesses and things like that, although fraud can happen there too. So I'm glad the auditor did that. Just makes me think, what other money are we losing because of similar public benefits fraud?
Or $250 million over 4 years, each year of the 4 years for a total of $1 billion that could have gone to more families that needed some assistance, or just save the state money to begin with.
Well, right, and often, we'll come up with various ways to check this. For example, people have to recertify or reapply for benefits from time to time. Almost as a reflex, there's a group of folks who work within this sphere. They object to all of that. Any possible, maybe instead of once they get it, they always get it, maybe after 3 months they could apply again, all of those kinds of things. And unless you have those kind of regular safeguards, we're going to have lots of audits that show this.
Well, yeah, usually the left likes to say, why are you against poor people? Why are you against these poor, underprivileged people? We're not. We just want to make sure that the resources are directed to the people that need it the most, so we can finally get them off those resources.
Right, and so there's plenty of money in the social safety net. If there's not, we can fund it. But of course, that money ends up either as taxpayers' money not being used for schools and roads and all of the other things that government has to pay for.
Yeah, speaking of resources, also the state's response, we had the big EF3 tornado that went through part of your district and also Senator McCauley's district just a couple weeks ago in March through the Lakeview Indian Lake community. And still there are 250 homes approximately as per FEMA and the local county's review saying that people are still displaced from their homes. And when I was over there this past week with you for a special meeting about what the plan should be to try to help these people out, there was still an extensive amount of cleanup that needed to be done. The weather certainly has not been cooperative, but you did talk to the governor, to the administration about a state response and not waiting for the federal government to finally make a determination.
Yeah, it was an interesting meeting, and really we should say thanks and great job to the local folks in Logan County Amber Fagan, Joe Antrim, the emergency management people, who I think essentially have been working nonstop since the day that this happened. And they've come up with a plan. RV Wholesalers is an entity that has worked in several Florida hurricanes, Hurricane Katrina. They're now supplying essentially temporary housing in the way of RVs in Hawaii. And those essentially are, we're going to have these here, the state would buy them, they'd provide temporary housing, and then of course the state would sell them afterwards. It would cost some money. And we have money in a special fund for these emergencies. I've been asking the folks in the controlling board to consider doing that. Well, I understand that FEMA, we can, and the governor is asking the federal government through FEMA to do that. It'll probably take 6 months, and the answer will probably be no. And in Hawaii, there's supposed to be 1,000 of these temporary trailers, and they've only put up 400 of them. Lots of folks are, instead, they want people to stay in hotels. And there may be other reasons why the folks want them to stay in hotels instead of in their own RV or some other housing. But, you know, the federal government's bad at most of the things that it does, including emergency management. Maybe if it's in the moment, the day of, but long-term planning and execution, you know, unless it's the U.S. military, they're going to be bad at it. So the state of Ohio is going to have to deal with this. We have the money to do it, and hopefully we'll execute on that here shortly.
Yep. Look for more on our website, On the Record. Just go to ohiosenate.gov, click on News, and you'll see it right there at the top called On the Record. We'll keep you informed on that. Now to the progressive left's campaign to gerrymander guaranteed wins for their candidates. I don't know if you've had a chance to see this, but it's the Citizens Not Politicians petition drive to get on the November ballot to strip the will of 70% of the voters that changed the redistricting process in 2015 and 2018. This is a 56-step, if not 60 flowchart that I found on X, or the former Twitter, from @OhioPoliticsGuru. Don't know who Guru is. Maybe he works for the campaign. He did say in his thread that he had already collected some 200 signatures for the petition. But to me, this is worse than trying to use a flip phone GPS to order a black regular coffee at a Starbucks. I mean, I put together bedroom furniture and furniture off of less complex blueprints and instruction sheets than this. What's your thought on this whole debacle?
Well, typically when someone drafts something that complicated, the reason they're doing that is they don't want anybody else to really understand what the process is. It's going to be mired, if not in actual obscurity, in a process that is so complex that people will simply give up trying to follow it and participate in it. So the process of how you decide who is going to be the decision maker, and then how the map is going to be drawn, and parts of that are actually obscured legally from a public disclosure. But that process will essentially do a couple things. One is the average citizen, the voter, is excluded from the process. They're not going to be able to participate in this because nobody knows what it means, okay? The second thing is the design of this, which is eliminating the population requirements, eliminating the requirements that local jurisdictions stay together, that we don't have elongated districts, that we split up communities of interest, will allow the kind of gerrymandering that the 2015 and 18 reform was designed to prevent. So the ACLU, the League of Women Voters, who is now supporting this, it must be a different group of women voters who are in the current league. They were against this kind of proposal in 2015. So, and I've mentioned this on a couple of occasions. This will likely result in many African American legislators being eliminated from their districts. And that's the design of this thing. It'll end up mostly with far left social progressives being elected in these districts. That's who the funders of this want in office making decisions. You don't have to believe me regarding the civil rights part of this. This happened in Michigan. They drew the map. Several African American legislators sued, and they won. And the court said it violated the 1964 Civil Rights Act. So this, again, is not about citizens. This is about far left progressives being able to get their people in office.
By the way, the point person, besides the former Chief Justice of the Ohio Supreme Court, Maureen O'Connor, the point person running the campaign is the same individual, and you can read all about it on the record, the Views the News Excludes, that I just mentioned on the website, ran the very same campaign in Missouri. And we have a lengthy column tying all of that together, that originally passed in Missouri. Then it was such a disaster, the voters repealed it 2 years later for some of the same reasons it violated the Voting Rights Act. And one thing that was very clear to me through this rather lengthy flow chart, harder than deciding what to order at Chipotle, was a lot of special masters appointed by a court, and in the end, I could summarize this in two bubbles, one circle and one square. The court draws the map. The court draws, so you have the judicial branch, totally separate branch of government than the legislative branch, and citizens are totally removed from having their people that they voted for be any part of this process. Shouldn't people elected to the General Assembly have some input into a redistricting process?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, if we want citizens to participate and have decisions, which they did clearly when they adopted the plan we currently have in place overwhelmingly in 2015 and 18, but they're also choosing the people who are making these decisions in their elections. The people making the decisions regarding this are not chosen by the voter, not chosen by the citizen. And who really is choosing them? Part of it is actually just random. There's actually part of this where they pick names out of a hat.
The Ohio Lottery show.
Yeah. So it's nowhere close to that. And so, you know, what we did find out is once the Supreme Court was removed from intervening in this process in 2023, the series of penalties and incentives to compromise happened. And in 2023, we had a unanimous bipartisan vote on a map, which we're using in the 2024 election. Now, having something that is unanimous and bipartisan and everybody gets along, it's just not very interesting news, and it's really bad news to the far left progressives who say, we don't want Democrats and Republicans getting along because then we don't get what we want. So there's a whole lot of reasons where people need to pick up the lid and look underneath as to what's in this pot.
And what's even interesting, the narrative from the legacy media is the plan was a disaster. The plan that was always a disaster, even though the voters, more than 70% of the voters approved it, it was a disaster. They seem to forget, and you won't see it anywhere reported, that all they would have to say, but it worked perfectly when you remove the special interest groups and you had unanimous bipartisan maps that resulted in the most compact districts in the history of the state.
Yeah, not only compact, but remember that most government in Ohio and most other states is really administered at the local level. And so that's why our Constitution's always had sort of a county-based bias, but this also makes sure that local jurisdictions, cities and villages, townships, those things stick together as much as possible. It can't always happen because of the population requirements. We're going to have county split, we're going to have all sorts of divisions, and that's going to make it tough to administer state government at the local level, the benefits, everything else that we do.
As you said, exactly the opposite of what their narrative was when this whole campaign was run and passed by the voters, and also what they wanted in that series of statewide hearings that were held around the state that you went to, I went to. We want compact maps, compact communities of interest. So, and that's not at all what this would do. We held a election security forum in Independence, Ohio. Senator Serino hosted, and it featured in last week. You probably saw our podcast with Senator Serino and Attorney General Dave Yost. If you haven't, you can find it on the Record and also on Spotify, and you can see it on YouTube. But it featured a dozen, if not more, county prosecutors from Northeast Ohio, mayors, police chiefs, and the Attorney General was right on point talking about the exact same things that the state is saying that they're seeing in Northeast Ohio related to the crisis at the border. And the takeaway was we are seeing new levels of organized crime, financial and otherwise, setting up shop in not just big cities in Ohio, but in almost every community that can be tied back to the border. And you will see the Border Security Forum in its entirety this week on the Record. So where do you stand on this whole issue of border security, and are you concerned about what it's doing to the crime rate in Ohio?
Well, I guess, frankly, I'm mystified that it's gotten this bad, because although obviously this is a important federal duty, it's not something that's as difficult as dealing with an international crisis overseas, a military crisis, and there's a lot of different decisions that have to get made. This is simply a matter of, here's the border, here's a fence, sorry you can't come in unless there's some special process that you have to go to. But right now, when someone says, I declare asylum, they say, okay, be in court in 3 years, see you later. Of course people aren't going to show up. So it's an incredible failure, but it's an incredible failure in an area that's relatively easy to deal with. There are things the federal government fails at that, it's hard, for example, in the middle of a Hurricane Katrina to get everything there at the right moment, and you can criticize how that was, things like that. So that's why this is so frustrating for most people. And of course, you hear the big issues or some of the bigger cases about murders, and those are horrific enough. But the ability to bring drugs across the border, and talk to Senator Johnson about this issue, who's really kind of an expert on the effects that drugs have in a community. But until we stop the flow of fentanyl, it doesn't make any difference what we're going to do locally in terms of drug rehab centers and the other social programs that we have. I was in Ashtabula a few weeks ago. There were two 20-something, I think two 25-year-olds who smoked marijuana that had fentanyl in it and died. Now, does that come right from Mexico? Probably, maybe not. But shrugging your shoulders at drugs, including marijuana and fentanyl, is really a bit of a fool's errand. I try to get people to stop saying recreational in front of the word marijuana. I understand why the people who wanted to pass this wanted to put that, because it made it seem harmless. But the federal government needs to secure the border. Of course, those folks are going to come to Ohio. Why? Well, Ohio's a rich state, has a big social safety net. In some cases, people are actually trying to bring those folks in to work. But the really horrific crimes are being caused by people who aren't here for work or freedom or anything else.
It's also interesting how initially a year ago, maybe a year and a half ago, where a lot of the big cities nationally, we want to be a sanctuary city. Now they're saying, we never wanted to be a sanctuary city, because their citizens are saying, we're fed up. Why are these migrants in my child's school and my child's here at home not learning anything? They also witness in some of these big cities, New York, for example, illegal migrants attacking police officers and then being let out the next day. So, I mean, it's a real danger. And one of the things regarding, you were talking about marijuana and fentanyl, the Attorney General was talking about how it's not just Mexican residents that are most people think are crossing the border. They had 30,000 Chinese nationals come across that were linked in some way, some of them, not all of them, but some of them certainly were linked to organized crime directly related to fentanyl. So that this is something that Ohioans are facing. And he also said, this leads me to my next question, that a lot of these drug-related organized crime organizations want to be in states that have legalized marijuana because it makes it easier for them to market their black market marijuana under the table because, well, it's just always going to be cheaper. And they know that they have an identifiable marketplace then, because if it's legal in Ohio, then they know there's pot smokers.
Well, right. There's not only pot smokers, but there is a group of folks out selling marijuana out of their basement. The black market is going to get created. Now, keep in mind that folks may say, hey, that's kind of cool. I can grow marijuana, use it, and sell it. Well, at some point, somebody else who has more nefarious ideas are going to be going to those Ohio citizens and saying, you're not selling marijuana around here anymore, and here's how we're going to make sure you don't do that. So it really is kind of a wild, wild west in many ways. You know, that's why we in the Senate with the governor's assistance worked so hard in December to try to get a program out there. The House has essentially said we're not interested in dealing with it. So I think, unfortunately, this, like many issues, will be forced to take action when a series of tragedies, some of which have already started happening, and then people will sit up and take notice.
Right. The Speaker said this week that was one of the questions that was asked about what are you going to do about marijuana, because certainly the governor was on board with the Senate's changes, and the quote was probably not going to happen.
Well, you know, again, if that's the way it is, it will happen. But unfortunately, there'll have to be a series of tragedies occur first before action is taken.
Something that the legislature pushed through, of course, House Bill 68 early in the year. It did include a veto override. But now the ACLU is challenging the law that is designed to protect minors from transgender surgeries and some of these radical hormone-related treatments. And you've heard me say before, when the left likes to talk about trans kids, we're really talking about children that have a behavioral disorder, that you're not born trans, that you can't change your chromosomes, and so forth and so on. It's being defended by the Attorney General's office. And Dave Yost had put out had printed in National Review a good column. The headline is, Ohio Stands for Children and Against Gender Activists. And one of the first lines in it is, a child cannot buy alcohol or tobacco in Ohio. A child cannot enter a legally binding contract under the law. It is void and unenforceable. So there's lots of things that we don't allow children to do in Ohio. It goes on to say you can't get a tattoo without parental consent if you're a minor. And oh, by the way, you can't vote if you're a minor, even if you have parental consent. What do you think about this overall continued effort to try to target a small group of people for political points?
Well, I think you should expand that out. Ohio also restricts the things that parents can let their kids do or what parents can do to their children. And so there are a lot of parents who, of course, are prosecuted for abuse and neglect of their children, have their children taken away. Because, you know, when we talk about parental rights and parental decision making, there, of course, is a line on which the side where the state has to intervene for the protection of the child. And that's why we ban these surgeries, even if the parent thinks it's okay. Because ultimately, it's the child as a citizen who's entitled to the protection of the state. Now, most of the time, we don't want to do that. And there's lots of things that parents do with their children, which may be questionable. You know, if you let your child do nothing but sit and eat terrible sugary foods and they're 100 pounds overweight and they become diabetic, well, we don't stop parents from doing that, even though that's probably not very good for your kid, right? So but this is one of the things, permanent surgery that alters somebody, the hormone blockers, all those sorts of things. The state does have a role in protecting its citizens.
Yep. And he went on to say that, in defending this, he says, while it's happening, we protect children as a class by creating laws that apply to children, not adults. But in its new challenge to Ohio's law prohibiting transgender medical interventions for children under the age of 18, the American Civil Liberties Union claims this unremarkable truth is somehow unconstitutional. Is it just a case of we need to keep up our funding source for a lot of these organizations on the left and just take it to court?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, the fact that a lawsuit's filed, it may make news, but that doesn't mean that it changes the law or changes the Constitution. The things that the League of Women Voters and the ACLU are worried about, of course, are tremendously different than they were in 1964 and 1978 and things like that. Most of those folks would look at this and give it a "you got to be kidding me." There is a far left agenda, and they use these organizations to sue, to advocate in elections and state houses all over. And as long as you recognize that, and I think you have to, it's easy to get angry when you're a legislator, to get angry with the League of Women Voters and the ACLU. But what we should understand is we're making the same dispassionate decisions we always made, right? Of course it's not right for a 13-year-old girl to have her breast removed because she has a moment in time when she's not sure who she is. But these folks actually say, we think it's okay, and we don't want to stop the state from doing that. So it's so easy for a legislator to see that they're on the right side of history, on the right side of the Constitution, that we do our job and we move on with other problems.
And before I move on, the article ends, the column ends, saying maybe this is basically why it was filed in state court instead of the federal court, because Chief Judge Sutton's opinion for the Sixth Circuit found that the Tennessee law, similar to Ohio's law, was unlikely to violate the Equal Protection Clause. In his words, laws like those in Tennessee and Ohio are equally applicable to all minors, no matter their sex at birth. So again, always trying to find an avenue to keep the funding going, and it's all driven by special interests.
Yeah, the most unfortunate part of this is that the solving other problems, dealing with the Indian Lake problems, dealing with school funding and getting money into the right schools so that underprivileged students have a good education, all of those things, we have to take up a large bandwidth, and unfortunately many in the media find this more interesting, at least to the people who are reading their publication, and so they want to talk about this instead of, let's talk about the $1 billion that Keith Faber, that $1 billion problem, and who are these people? Let's go find these and interview these people and say, did you steal money from the state of Ohio? That all sort of falls on the table. So, we just do what we can here. So.
Ohio Senate President Matt Huffman, thanks for joining us. We appreciate it.
Thanks, John. Good to be here again.
Thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you soon.